Then I shall commence recording. Okay, so today we are going to talk about the movie. So did you guys have any trouble accessing the movie via the thing? Okay, good. So yeah, so my understanding is you have to click Oglethorpe University first, and then it'll take you to your email address. Okay. So I hope you liked this movie. I'm really interested to talk to you about it tomorrow because I know that for a lot of you, you might not have seen a silent film before because, you know, we stopped making those a century ago. And also for a lot of you, that may not have seen sort of a film about this war because we make so few movies about World War I, which is kind of weird. We make a lot of movies about World War II. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we can talk about wings. All right. So, basically, one of the things that's important to know about this movie is that it's not quite as like unrealistic as the other movies that we watched, but it does still have like an important place in history. So the reason that I chose this one is because it's still like super melodramatic and it's still not like entirely accurate. And also it's historically important. So this movie wasn't made until like a full decade after the war ended. So it was people's sort of like perspective on the war. It was a lot of people looking back at the war and thinking about how it went for them and like what parts of it stuck out. So in that regard, it is still sort of a historical perspective. But it was still made much closer to the war than any of the other films that we've watched. So in that regard, it's a little bit more accurate. So let's start with a few sort of general facts. So it was made in 1927, so really almost a century ago, which is just so cool, so cool. And it cost a lot of money. It cost $30 million in today's dollars, not in those dollars, but in today's dollars, which on the one hand is not very much for a film, but on the other hand was a lot for a film back then. But the reason it was so expensive was because they had to use so many planes, because they had to use all real planes and they had to use all, you know, real pilots because of course there was no CGI yet. So the first ever Oscars were held that year, 1927, and it won. But at the time, there was like a best Oscar for like drama and a best Oscar for production, and they won technically the best production Oscar, and the next year they combined them. So essentially, it's the first best Oscar winner, or best picture Oscar, but you know, a little bit of technicality. So it was, for a lot of people, they consider it the first big budget action film. So there had been a lot of relatively big budget films so far, but they had mostly been like dramas. They had been like love stories or sort of historical reenactments. So this was the first one that had like action, like plane fights and death and fighting. And so it was the first sort of like blockbuster action film that anybody ever really made. So I wanted to explain a little bit about the sort of movie making process back then. So basically there were like 5 or 6 really big studios, and that's all. And these studios owned their actors essentially, because you would sign a contract with the studio. So you worked for the studio and then they would just put you in whatever films they wanted you to be in. So you had like a little bit of say, like you could, I mean, if you were a powerful enough person, you could straight up turn it down, but not really. So basically what the studios did was they owned theaters and they owned production companies. So they had to make a lot of movies all the time to fill up the theaters. So Paramount, for instance, at this point in history was making like 60 or 70 movies a year. Sometimes they were turning out about 2 a week. So they would film these movies real fast. And that's why the production value is a little bit lower on some of them. But also it was kind of like soap operas. Like the actors were just used to it. They would learn their lines really fast. They would act them out and then they'd go to the next job, you know? So it was a whole different process and it was a whole different like feeling about movies. Like these days, like a lot of actors and directors take like 3 years to make a movie and it sucks up their whole life and it's like everything. And these actors were basically just like choo choo choo, just like churning them out. So they made the very first talkie, which was in 1927, which was The Jazz Singer, which is super racist, but it was the first talkie, so it's historically important. But even though they had the ability to make talkies at this point, they weren't necessarily making them because it was super expensive. Basically, they had the technology to film and they had the technology to record sound, but they didn't have the ability to record both at once. So essentially they would film, there'd be like a film reel and a sound reel and you would have to play them at the same time. It used to be a lot harder to be a movie projectionist. Now you're like, play. So they kept making silent films like this one for a while just because it was so much cheaper. And if you wanted to make, you know, 70 movies a year, cheap was important. So the other thing that's really historically interesting about this movie is that it came out before the Hays Code. So they made a lot of movies in the 1920s and a little bit early in the 1930s that were like super sexy. And there was like a lot of nudity and there was a lot of drunkenness and sexuality and stuff like that because that was okay back then. Like there was just this period of time, you know, especially in the roaring 20s, where people were just chill with like nudity and sexuality and drinking and smoking. And so it wasn't until 1934 that people got super prudish about it. And so the Hays Code was, this guy Hays was basically like, won't someone please think of the children, which and so they made a lot of things illegal in movies. So if you've ever wondered why, like in some TV shows, the parents sleep in 2 separate beds, that's because of the Hays Code. So they had a whole list of things you weren't allowed to do. And one of them was like show characters sleeping in the same bed. You couldn't show any nudity whatsoever. You could show kissing, but it had to be less than 3 seconds and no one was allowed to open their mouths, which is hilarious. There's certainly no homosexuality. So when these 2 characters kiss in this movie, a lot of scholars consider it the first gay kiss on screen. So there's sort of a question of whether it was meant to be romantic or not. In the movie, they're very clearly chasing these female characters, but at the same time, they clearly care more about each other than they do any of the women who are running around. So like there is sort of this question of whether it was meant to be like low-key gay. And I don't know. But technically, this is the first ever same-sex kiss on the mouth ever recorded on film. So throughout this movie, there's a couple of things that probably weren't super surprising to you because we're so jaded by basically everything these days. But if you remember when they first go to the office to sign up for the war, there's like a little bit of male nudity. And there's a point where she's changing during the scene where they're in Paris, where you can see her breast for a second. And there's a point where one of the actors gets drunk. So like all of that was considered super scandalous, hyper scandalous. And you weren't allowed to do any of that anymore, basically until the 70s. The Hays Code was really powerful, and it kept everything like super PG for a long time. So this movie kind of like squeaked in before that code got passed. They were able to get away with a lot more stuff. So the production of this movie was next level. And it was really, really complicated because they were using all real planes and they had to film some plane crashes. So they did have to crash some planes on purpose, and then 2 of them crashed on accident. Only 1 person died, which is kind of remarkable considering the planes at the time were, again, basically tin cans with explosives strapped to them. And the pilots were all barely trained. So it was kind of remarkable that they managed to get away with like so little in regard to like injury or disaster. So to film it, mostly they used actors who were also pilots, but they used a lot of Army Air Corps pilots as well. So they brought in a lot of people. We didn't have the Air Force yet. The Army just had like a sort of a separate branch. So they brought in a lot of those people. So there were like 300 pilots total. The pilots often had to film at the same time they were flying. So all of the scenes that you see where you can see the actor's face really clearly, that's because there was like a camera mounted on the airplane. So they had to fly and film and act all at the same time, which is not something we expect people to do anymore. So in that regard, it's totally a technological masterpiece. Nobody had ever seen anything quite like this. But it was also sort of a disaster. It took a really long time. It was supposed to take 9 months, it was supposed to take 1 month because that was how quick these things usually were, but it took 9 months. And part of that was that they had to wait for the weather because you could fly these planes in the rain, but not really, because as you notice, they don't have covers. It's basically like a convertible plane. So they had to wait for really good weather, but they also wanted to wait for clouds because basically if you're filming a plane on a completely clear sky, it's really hard to tell how fast it's going and how far off the ground it is. But if you film a plane flying past a cloud, you get some idea of like where it is relative to the ground and how fast it's going. So essentially, they had to wait for days with like big old fluffy cumulus clouds because if they filmed any other weather, it was really hard to see the planes and it was really hard to like get an idea of what was going on with the plane. So they had to like wait for the weather, and they were in Texas, so the weather was reasonable, but still. So the problem with being at a hotel in a remote area of Texas for 9 months was exactly what you imagine. All of the actors got in a lot of trouble. There was just a whole bunch of drinking. It was super rowdy. Clara Bow, who we'll talk about in a second, and Gary Cooper had an affair. Apparently, a lot of the elevator girls got pregnant. Like it was a problem. But by the end, they had made something, again, it's historically important. So this is the director. This is William Wellman, and he was a fighter pilot. Which is one of the reasons that he wanted to make this movie. And he made several movies after this that involved fighter pilots and involved planes. Like so many other actors of his generation, he made just a shit ton of movies because that's what everybody was doing. So he made more than 80, probably maybe in the 100 range, which is so many movies. Directors don't do that anymore, but they were just, they had to crank them out. So he flew a lot of the planes himself, and he flew with cameras occasionally, and he arranged all of the explosions himself. He was really into explosions. And so basically he sort of brought his own expertise to this movie because he wanted to tell a story about pilots during World War I, since he was one. And so he basically convinced the studio to let him make this movie, and it was one of his first ever movies. He made a lot of movies that you've probably heard of, especially if you're a film scholar at all. But one of them that I thought might interest you was he made the very first version of A Star is Born. A Star is Born has been made like 3 or 4 times. It's a good story, right? So you may have seen recently the Bradley Cooper and Lady Gaga version. So he made the very first version. So he's pretty cool, and he seems like a reasonable man. This is Clara Bow. So I don't know if you've ever seen Clara Bow before, but you might have, because she was sort of the original like Hollywood starlet. And the reason that we call these women It girls is because of her. She was in a movie called It. This was not the clown one, but a different one. And so it was her like starring role, like her first really big picture. And so people started referring to her as the It girl because she was the girl from the movie It. And so referring to her as the It girl led to historically referring to everybody as the It girl. So if you've heard of this in terms of like somebody who's sort of newly famous and everywhere and everybody wants to work with her, it's Clara Bow. So she was super problematic. She was just drunk all the time and kind of a hoe and like really like difficult to work with, like prone to tantrums, but she was also a fantastic actress, and she was super, super bankable. So since she was one of the most popular actresses in America, what they said was that you could cast another woman in the role, but it would sell twice as much if she was in the role. During the like late 20s and early 30s, she worked a lot because she was so bankable. People they wanted to see what she was doing. They wanted to read about what she was doing in the tabloids. They wanted to just like sort of any other, I think, tabloid actress. Like she was just the first one where they were sort of focused on her personal life and they wanted to know where she was and what she was drinking and who she was having sex with and what she was up to. And we didn't really treat celebrities that way kind of until her. So she was sort of one of the first actresses that like became a public figure in that way. So her life story is really interesting and kind of tragic. But she's a really fascinating sort of human, and she had that interesting role in like film history. So this was her quote about the movie itself. She said it was a man's picture and she was just the whipped cream, which I was like, damn, Clara Bow. But it's true. All right. And you can't tell, but she has red hair. Later on, she did a couple of talkies and she did 1 or 2 color films too, I think. And you can tell that she has red hair later. So what I want to do next is talk about the characters so that we can sort of talk about who they represent and like what their sort of meaning is to the larger story. So we start with Jack. And Jack's kind of the like everyman. He likes to tinker with his little machines. He's from a sort of a working class background. Like he's just sort of the like everyday dude. So in a lot of ways, he's like a stand-in for all of the American soldiers. He's, pleasantly good looking, but he's kind and he's kind of guileless and he just wants to work hard and he loves everybody. So he's like a really good sort of like bland leading man character. Like he's objectively fine, right? So he wants to go to war really badly. So in that way, he's very much like the other guys that you're going to read about in the book. Like he was on board, man, and he's young. This actor was like 19 when they were filming this, which is historically accurate. But he basically was meant to sort of stand in as like, this is the guy that all of us were cheering for. Like, this is the American soldier. Here he is. So he was not in the war, but he did learn how to fly for this, which I think was nice. So he had to take a lot of flying lessons so that they could do those close-ups, especially when he's trying to shoot down that plane. That part was very dramatic. So his name is Buddy Rogers, by the way. If you've ever seen any of the rest of his movies, and you may have, he did a lot of Westerns after this. So this is David Armstrong, and he was meant to be kind of the antagonist. So he was like the rich boy. He was the one that the girl was really in love with. He was the one with like the privileged background. So he was meant to sort of counterposition, like to contrapose the like everyday guy. So this actor, his name is Arlen, actually was a fighter pilot. So he already knew how to fly, which was great. And so he filmed almost all of his own stunts, except for the part where he wrecks the plane. They made someone else do that. But he filmed and acted the whole time. So he was really like kind of a great person to have for this kind of movie, because you can't just expect people to know how to fly, right? But he was meant to be, you know, sort of hateable at the beginning. He was rich, he was handsome, the girl was in love with him. And so the gradual sort of transition between being the antagonist and being sort of one of the co-stars was a really important aspect of the film, especially in terms of like brotherly love in regard to soldiers. But again, some people argue a little low-key gay. So this is Mary Preston. So she was meant to be literally the girl next door, which is, again, part of why we use that phrase. You know, she literally lived next door to the main character. And some of my favorite scenes are the ones in the very beginning where she's like trying so hard to flirt with him, and he is just like it's just going straight over his head, because she's so expressive. And this was during the era where everyone had like one single line of eyebrow hairs that went like all the way almost to the other side of your skull, which all these women of this generation plucked their eyebrows to look like her, and they never came back. So she basically was sort of the stand-in for like the all-American girl. You know, she loved her soldier, she worked hard, eventually she contributed to the war effort. Like, she was meant to be this sort of like, you could imagine yourself in her place. Like, you could imagine yourself falling in love with Jack, because she was sort of everybody. And the scene also where she changes into that sparkly dress is like, what? You know, it's like the dramatic reveal, like in modern movies where they take down their ponytail and take off their glasses. Like, sort of that vibe, which I appreciate. So this guy, you may remember, he was the immigrant who had to keep sort of proving himself as an American soldier. So his name in the film was Herman Schwimpf. And basically, you might remember him from the scenes where they're enlisting, and everybody was like, oh, with a name like that, like, and you know, his accent, like, you're not even an American, why do you want to be here? And he has that terrible tattoo of the American flag that he keeps making it ripple. I love that part. So he is definitively the comedic relief, like throughout the movie. You know, he pops up and provides comedic relief, which is important. You need that in a film. But he's also, I would argue, sort of playing the role of the recent immigrant to America. Because there's this sort of question, like he keeps saying to the other people, like, am I not as American as you? And so this is one of the things that I want to talk about tomorrow, this idea of like, well, how long would you have to be in America to be an American? And like, how, like, do you have to like earn patriotism? Because the argument for this character was that he cared as much as everybody else. He just had an accent, you know. He might have cared more than everybody else based on that tattoo. So this actor did a lot of comic relief stuff over the course of his life too. He was really prolific. Here is our girl Silvia. So she does not have much to do. This is a very typical sort of romantic interest lead. She was the center of the love triangle. So basically she was in love with the rich boy, but the poor boy was in love with her. And her failure to just tell him that she wasn't in love with him was a real problem. She says she felt that, and I'm sure she did, like we've all been there, but still, you know, he takes that locket and, you know, to war with him and believes that she's in love with him, and it's a really important part of the story. But she's also meant to sort of serve as a contradiction, again, that sort of contrapose of the girl next door. Because they make a point of mentioning that she is rich and she's from the city and she's not normally there. So she's sort of supposed to be like exotic. She's supposed to be threatening in a sense to the girl next door, but it's supposed to be really meaningful when the girl next door ultimately wins. The last time we see Silvia, she's just sort of like being sad. Well, to be fair, she's feeling sad because David died, but she like basically has no lines. Her whole role is just to sort of serve as like a desirable doll. Oh, and Gary Cooper. So for one thing, this was Gary Cooper's first ever film role. And Gary Cooper was one of the most famous actors of his age for, I mean, honestly, probably 30 years. He was one of the most famous actors in America. And he was a total hoe too. He slept with everybody. It was a problem. But he was incredibly handsome. So this was his first ever film role. And he only got this role because he was sleeping with Clara Bow. But still, so he comes into the tent and we only meet him for a few minutes. He introduces himself as Cadet White, and he's like, oh, I'm just going to do a couple of figure eights before chow, and then dies. So in a sense, I would argue that he's meant to sort of represent the like fragility of life and the fragility of these soldiers, because a lot of the air pilots died real fast. It was
Like,
not unusual for them to die so quickly. Did
yeah,
somebody,
it's fleeting. The
what?
fleeting nature, like the fleeting nature of life.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Is that a good word for it? Fleeting?
I like it. Yeah, that'll do. So that's kind of what he's meant to represent, you know, like he's there, he's young, he's healthy, and then boom, he's dead. And again, that was extremely common for soldiers. This is one of the things you'll see in your book, this idea that people just die. They're standing behind you 1 minute and then they're dead the next minute. You know, like this is one of the sort of like atrocities of war. So in a sense, his whole job was to like be a background character and then immediately die. But Gary Cooper's very interesting if you ever want to look him up. The other important character, the Germans. So the way that the Germans are represented in the film is really, really interesting, and I'm interested to hear what you guys think about that tomorrow. But on the one hand, they're for sure the bad guys. You know, they're talking all the time about like, oh, I can't wait to go kill some Heinies. But on the other hand, they're like incredibly chivalrous. They keep dropping off notes, you know, and like supplies, and they don't shoot people who are already injured, and it's kind of interesting. So if you think back to a lecture yesterday, this was actually very common for the German army. They were efficient and they were ruthless, but they were also very clear on the rules. And so the rules of war were very important, at least at first, to the Germans in terms of like, there are just things you don't do, at least at first. So this picture is from the Flying Circus, because they talked about the Flying Circus a little bit in the film. So I wanted to show it to you in color, because I think they in black and white don't look like a circus at all, but in real life the planes were painted all of these like super dramatic colors, and they really did kind of look like a circus band. But also there were so few planes to go around that they just sort of traveled to wherever the problems were, like a traveling circus. So basically the lead guy and all of his you know, sort of co-pilots would just sort of hop around in their super colorful planes and like take care of problems. So they were very, very famous during World War I for like being a fighter squad. And they're tiny baby planes. Okay. So next, I wanted to tell you about how the film was received. So basically, it was meant in a sense to like honor the pilots. So if you recall, it starts with this really like maudlin, dramatic sort of like overview, and there's all the, you know, the text on screen, the scrolling text. Star Wars didn't invent that. But basically he dedicated the film to those young warriors of the sky whose wings are folded about them forever. So the film itself is dedicated to all those World War I pilots who died in action. And the thing is, they don't necessarily address this as well in the film as they should have, but they almost all died, like real fast. It was an incredibly dangerous thing to do. There was very little training. As you recall, there was a training montage in the film, but like they spent almost no hours in the plane before going up. And so on average, American fighter pilots lasted about 18 hours of flight time. On average, the British fighter pilots lasted about 6 weeks, so that might be sort of a match. So basically, it was very rare for them to live through the war. So it was considered like an honorable position. Like it was really badass to be a fighter pilot, you know, like especially to be a flying ace, super badass. But it was also just incredibly dangerous, and not everybody lived. So it was one of those things that's quite tricky in regard to war and honor and prestige. Like it was the most prestigious and the coolest and the hardest thing that you could do, but it was also just incredibly dangerous, incredibly dangerous. So these on the right are the wings that they would give the pilots. So if you ever see those, if you're ever sifting through, you know, your grandparents' stuff in their basement and you see that, that's what that is. So they basically would give them these pens, and you might recall there was a scene where like one of the girls at the club, I guess, stole it. But basically the pens were like a signifier of who you were and where you belonged. So this was essentially the first movie with planes. There had been some like background planes in other movies, but this was the first movie that used planes and that filmed from planes. So the authenticity of the film was one of the most important things about it. So in this picture, you can see them rigging one of the planes with the camera. So they had some cameras that were front facing and some cameras that were back facing to get the the pilot a little bit better to get those close-ups. And also I just wanted you to see again how small the plane is and how just like cobbled together it is. It's like, I can't believe they can fly, those planes. That was one of the most important things about the reception for the film. A lot of the fighter pilots who had been in World War I talked about how accurate it was and how it was like the combat scenes especially were considered really, really important. People still talk about the authenticity of those combat scenes, about how tense they are and how real they look. So again, this was sort of the first accurate war movie. So that was very, very important, this idea that they were showing what it really looked like for the people who were there. So critics loved it. They were like, yeah. They thought it was too sentimental, and they're not wrong about that. It certainly was dramatic. But over the course of history, it's become, you know, an important film in that regard. It did win the Oscar that year. That's a picture of the first ever Oscars. They didn't televise them for a couple decades. It's the only silent film ever to win. All of the best Oscars went to talkies from there on out. And it did also win the first Oscar for Best Engineering Effects, which they deserved, because that was intense. Now it's in the National Film Archives, although we'll talk about how weird that is here in a second. But basically, there's an archive of like all of the art that we believe to be important, and it's like underground and it's like super safe and bomb-proof and all that sort of thing. And this is one of the films that's in there, just in case, you know. So like if America blows up or if aliens come, we have like a set thing to show people, and this is one of them. So audiences loved it. So for a couple of reasons. One, everybody really liked to go to movies at the time. And the way that movies worked is that they just played. They just played and played and played. So you didn't come at a certain time. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to see a 7:15 movie. You just kind of walked into the theater, like whenever you happened to walk in, and you would watch the film from wherever it was, and then you could stay essentially until it came back to where it was. So often people would go and just sit in the movie theater all day and just watch either the same film over and over or like the newsreels or something like that. And in part, this was because the film theaters were one of the first places to have air conditioning. So if you can imagine this time of year, Atlanta, 1930, you probably would have gone and sat in air conditioning too. So on the one hand, that was like really important. Everybody just liked to see movies. Like 80% of Americans, I think, saw a movie every month at that point in time. But on the other hand, it had Clara Bow. And people were straight up obsessed with Clara Bow. She was like the thing. But also, Americans were really into airplanes right then. So we had airplanes in the First World War, but we had been sort of like improving them over the course of time. So this movie came out the same year that Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic. And I don't know if you've ever read about that, but it's fascinating. I got real obsessed with it one summer and read everything about it. But this parade on the right here is when Charles Lindbergh came home from flying across the Atlantic. So he was the first person ever to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Pretty much everybody else who tried that summer died. And part of the problem was that it was really hard to get enough fuel to cross the ocean, but still make the plane light enough to take off. So Lindbergh was the first person who ever did it. And he had like a compass and a pencil and a pad of paper. And that was all. We hadn't really invented radios yet. We hadn't invented satellites yet. So he just sort of flew by himself for like 17 hours or something. He was just an amazing dude. Weird, problematic, but amazing. So basically, he had just done this crazy flying feat. So Americans at the time were like, planes! Like everybody was super excited about airplanes. So the combination of a movie that you could watch inside with Clara Bow and airplanes was explosive. People were super into it. The thing that I wanted to tell you about why it's so interesting that it's in the film archives now, is because it was one of the lost films. So for a long time, the studios didn't necessarily have like a repository of the movies that they had made. They didn't have like a safe place to put them. So a lot of movies from this era were just entirely lost. Because the films, you know, would go out, the canisters would go out to theaters all around America, and then they would just be thrown away or something. So the studios didn't have recordings of every single film they'd ever made. And they certainly didn't have safe ones. So there were a lot of films that just sort of like disappeared into the ether. There's still a lot. And this movie was thought to be one of them. And they didn't find a copy of this movie until 1992, which is crazy. And then in 92, they found a copy. And then that was in Paris for some reason. Like nobody knew why it was there, but they found it and they were like, yeah, so they restored it. And then a couple of years later, they found a negative. And then they took that to the Skywalker Ranch, which I thought was kind of nice, which is where what George Lucas owns, and they restored it entirely. So the version that you watched is the restored version from the negatives. So these days, it's a lot easier to like store our film and store our film archives, essentially. Like we have climate controlled rooms and that sort of thing, but in those days, you just made a movie and like sent it out and then that was it. So it's nice that we found it. I think that's kind of exciting. All right, let's talk about the plots. So you may have seen stuff about dogfights before. One of the weirdest sort of pop culture references to dogfights is the dog Snoopy from Peanuts. You know how he's always sitting on top of his doghouse and he has like the goggles and the scarf. This is what he's doing. He's pretending to be the Red Baron, who was a really famous German aviator, which is weird, but whatever. So the dog fights were basically like one-on-one air battles, and we don't do this anymore. This is not the way that we fight anymore, in part because our weapons are more sophisticated, but basically you and your squadron would take off and like fly straight towards another squadron, and then you would sort of like pick who you were going to chase, and then it would become like a one-on-one battle between you and that guy. They were all guys. And so it was a really intense thing. Like you had to be good at flying, you had to be good at strategy, you had to like really want to kill another human. Like it was a tricky way to fight, but it was very exciting and very like honorable. So the guys who did it, again, were considered like the coolest members of the Air Force. Oh, we didn't have the Air Force, sorry, but the coolest members of the Army. So the flying aces, the fighting aces, you've probably heard that before. Like, you know, whenever an old guy's like, good job, ace, that's what they mean. That's where this word came from. So the dogfights themselves are hyper realistic in this movie. Again, in part because they were filmed by dudes who were there. So that's why the parts of this movie are actually kind of scary. And part of the dramatic language, they talk about there being chivalry amongst these knights in the air, which is like, sure. But essentially, they kind of were knights, except instead of horses, they had tiny little airplanes. And then the German observation balloons, I love these. They're so cool. They're not quite blimps because they hadn't quite gotten that far. So they're somewhere between just like a big old balloon and a blimp, and they were called Zeppelins. And you may have heard of this because the band Led Zeppelin is so named because a critic saw it early on and he thought they were so terrible that he said they were going to take off like a Led Zeppelin. It was an insult. He meant that they were never going to get off the ground. But they heard that and they were like, yeah, well, cool. So they just named their band Led Zeppelin. So that may be where you've heard of Zeppelins before. But basically, they were just big-ass balloons that were like a little bit tougher. They were sort of like hot air balloons, except that they did have, some of them had fans so that you could direct them a little bit more like blimps. And basically what you would do is you would ride in that little basket on the bottom, and it was for reconnaissance. So they would like, you know, tie you to some very, very long ropes and then float you up in the air. And then from up in the air, you could look around and see where the enemy forces were. And then they would pull you back down and you would tell people what you saw. So it was like these days, I guess we use drones probably or just satellites, but it was sort of an early version of reconnaissance. So it was very clever, but they were full of explosive gas. So if you shot one, just, so that was a problem, or a good thing, depending on which side of the war you were on. But there was one in the movie, which I thought was pretty exciting. Let's see. So at one point when they get shot down, they see the infantry. And those are the guys who are called the Doughboys. And nobody is sure why American infantrymen were called Doughboys. Some people think it had to do with how dusty they got, and some people think it had to do with the mistranslation from French, but like nobody's sure. But anyway, that's what they were called. So within, you know, the armed forces, there's a lot of like ranks, and there's the manifest ones in terms of like, you know, corporal, lieutenant, private, that sort of thing. But there's also the sort of like latent ranks, which is like who's the coolest. And so the Doughboys are considered kind of the lowest of the low. Like these are the infantrymen, these are the foot soldiers. They have probably virtually no skills. They're the first to die, like they're on the front lines. So they were important because they were soldiers, but they weren't considered as cool or as important as the airboys or the airmen who were flying the planes. So they were the ones who were involved in trench warfare, which is what we talked about yesterday, and which is, again, what you'll read about this week. So on the one hand, like, were they vitally important? Yes. On the other hand, did they sort of sneer at them in the movie? Yes. The Doughboys were considered almost like cattle or like equipment or something. Like they were sort of expendable, which is a shitty way to think about humans, but that's war, right? So when they run into the Doughboys, and that's why they call them the Doughboys, in case you were confused. Oh, I also wanted to tell you a little about the planes. So again, we were just developing planes. And this guy on the right is a reenactor. It turns out there are World War I reenactors. But he doesn't really fight. He just has like incredibly authentic planes and outfits. But I wanted to show it to you so that you could get an idea, especially of how big the planes were in relation to a human body. So like seriously, they're the size of like a Suburban or like an Escalade. Like it's just a tiny, and the engine wasn't nearly as powerful as the car engines that we have now. So it was just a super risky thing to do, but they weren't that hard to fly. Like there weren't very many buttons. So as long as you didn't die, it wasn't too difficult. But there was mostly like a go forward button and a go up and down and a sideways button, and that's all. Well, there weren't even buttons there. So most of the Americans were flying these little tiny little dudes over here. At one point we saw that big German Gotha plane, which is just so gorgeous and so huge. And also I thought you would think it was funny that most of the German fighter planes were called Fokkers. And we didn't, curse words go in and out of fashion, and we hadn't invented fuckers yet, but there's some thought that this comes from that, that our current F word, if you will, comes from the German Fokkers. That people were basically like, those Fokkers, and then you can see how it might have transitioned. So this is not necessarily important, but I just wanted to show you to sort of give you an idea of the range of the size of the planes. And of course, for some of you, I imagine this will be the best part of the whole class. Airplanes are just so interesting. But anyway, so I just wanted to give you an idea of some of them were much larger than others, and everybody was flying slightly different planes, and that's in part because everybody was like making the planes themselves. The planes were so new that very often the planes that you were flying had been created like 2 weeks earlier by some guy who'd never made a plane before. So there was just a huge range of them, but they were almost all biplanes with the propeller at the front at this time. So,
I have a question
about planes.
If you like look at the crosses, is there a difference between the one that has like a fanned out tip versus the like straight one?
Oh yeah, so that's the Iron Cross. And initially the Iron Cross was British, the fanned out version, and the tighter, like more perpendicular version was German. But in the next war, the Germans, for some reason that is unclear to me, stole the Iron Cross. So initially the Iron Cross was a, not Roman Catholic, but what are monks? I forget. Anyway, it's a religious, old religious symbol. So initially the British had it, and then it sort of transitioned over the course of the next war. So you should, in theory, be able to look at the plane from far away and tell whose side they're on because of the signals. Good question. Okay. So the other thing that I wanted to sort of draw your attention to, which was like bizarre over the course of the movie, was how dramatic the language was. And this is typical of movies from the time, to be fair. Like all of the movies were so dramatic and so maudlin and so extra, kind of, in part because there wasn't any spoken language. So you had to read the whole movie anyway, so it might as well be super dramatic. And in this movie also because they were trying to like honor all of the people who had died in the war. So they sort of felt obligated to talk about the pilots, especially, as though they were heroes, you know, knights and that sort of thing. But I really love this line. Like a mighty maelstrom of destruction, the war now drew into its center the power and pride of all the earth. Dun, dun, dun. He means America. Like, remember, America didn't even show up to this war until like most of the way through. So basically, they're trying to sort of like glorify the American fighter pilots and argue that they were the power and the pride of all the earth, and that they showed up and won the war, and it was no problem. Amazing, amazing. Such good dramatic language, swift and straight as arrows of vengeance. Sometimes I wish we still talk like this. So also, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the way that they had to like get the actors to do. So you probably noticed that every time somebody got shot, they would like grab the place where they had gotten shot and then blood would come out. And that's because we hadn't really figured out how to do self-exploding blood packets yet. So basically they had like a little packet of like red dye in their hands, and then they would like smush it, and then it was mint. So if you were wondering why everyone kept grabbing their own injuries with a full fist, that's why. Because very often, like again, in that dogfight scene between Jack and David, the pilot had to fly the plane, act, film himself, and die. So it was a very complex set of things to do. So in that regard, it was really surprising. But also, one of the things that's so famous about this film is that they didn't have special effects. They hadn't really invented special effects yet. So everything that they did had to be what we call practical effects. And you've probably seen practical effects. People still definitely use those. Peter Jackson uses them a lot, for instance, like in the Lord of the Rings movies. But for these movies, they had to do everything with perspective. They had a couple of stunt planes, but they only used, like tiny prop planes, but they only used them like a couple of times. So the crashes had to be done. They had to like actually crash those planes. They got in trouble for that. And they had to do all of the fires for real. One guy did get burned. So it's very dangerous to do practical effects. That's why we don't do it anymore. But that's one of the things, and especially if you haven't seen the movie yet, keep an eye on that, because these days we're sort of, I think, immune to things that are big crashes or big explosions because we just assume that they're fake. And they are. But in these days, they've really had to act out all of that. So like everything that is dramatic and physical and dangerous was real. And that's, again, one of the reasons why this movie is so historically vital.
When they crashed the planes, were there people in them, or were they unmanned planes?
There were people in them.
They
They were stunt pilots. Like they crashed them on purpose, except for one, but they crashed them on purpose for the most part. But yeah, there were people in them.
How did they not die from that? It seems like your neck would break from the impact.
No, I think if you watch it, they sort of gently crash. like there's most of the crash scenes are sort of like at an angle and not like face down. I think there's one face down crash, but that's a toy plane. But other than that, I don't know how they didn't die. I don't know how stunt people don't die. I think they're a different variety of human. Bendy or something. I don't know. But only people got injured, but only one person died, even though they crashed all those planes for real. Amazing. Okay, so this part you probably enjoyed very much. So at one point in the film, they go on leave. And this was accurate. And so a lot of the soldiers who went on leave, who are from America, they couldn't go back to America because leave usually lasted 2 weeks, but maybe not, maybe just 4 or 5 days. So a lot of the pilots who were on leave went from Germany to France because France was occupied, but it was still, like in Paris anyway, like largely left alone. So there was a lot of fighting in France, but like in more rural France. Paris was largely left by itself. For a while. Later on, we start bombing Paris, but this was a great time to go to Paris. Paris in the 1920s, like you've probably seen like Moulin Rouge or so. So like the club that they go to was sort of a contemporary to Moulin Rouge. And it's a real club, and it's still there if you want to go see it. And there's still can-can dancers and everything. So basically, it was like a place, they called it the capital of the world's gaiety, which is amazing, or here was forgetfulness. But basically, it was a place that everybody was just partying, like full time. Like this was an escape from the war. So there was a lot of stuff in Paris that just wasn't anywhere else. Like there was a lot of like open drinking and smoking and prostitution and like premarital sex, and like everybody was having a great time. What they did on leave in this movie is only sort of suggested because they didn't want to say like, and then all of the pilots bought prostitutes, because even though we didn't have the Hays Code yet, you still weren't supposed to say. And if you remember at the end of the movie, he like apologizes to Mary and he's like, I didn't have sex with that girl, and still doesn't realize it was her. So it was just sort of suggested that the soldiers on leave were like drinking but not getting into too much trouble. And speaking of which, the scene where he's getting drunk, they're showing it as champagne, but there's sort of the suggestion that it's absinthe. So you've probably heard of absinthe before, but in the olden days, absinthe was made with an ingredient called wormwood, and occasionally it did cause hallucinations. They no longer make absinthe with wormwood because it's so dangerous. But in the olden days, sometimes it really did cause people to have visual hallucinations. And so that's why you often see it like in cartoons, or you see it in really, really old movies, where when people are drinking absinthe and then like the fairies pop up or something like that. That's a really common analogy, like there's green or blue fairies.
So another thing about absinthe, well, a lot of it was the wormwood. what the French would do is they would basically pour absinthe on like a towel and then just wrap it on their face. And these towels were just nasty and like were not washed. So a lot of hallucinations were from like, oh, this is basically a microcosm of bacteria and we're putting alcohol in it. So
what could go wrong? Which is true. Absinthe was its own real problem. But if you noticed in the movie, he kept seeing those bubbles everywhere. And champagne does not cause you to hallucinate. So there's sort of the suggestion that they're showing him drinking champagne, but in reality he was drinking absinthe, which would be incredibly reasonable for a guy in Paris in the 20s, or in the teens at that point. Also, this was the first time that actor had ever gotten drunk in real life, because he was just a little baby. So I thought that was pretty funny. And then Mary shows up, the girl next door, right? So she realizes that that's where he is, and realizes that his leave has been called and they have to go back to war. And there's, of course, the makeover scene where that woman helps her get into like a fancy dress so she can steal him back. And it's very important that nothing actually happened, because again, even though it was before the Hays Code, they couldn't necessarily show them hooking up or anything. So the fact that the soldiers came in and saw her there and she was topless because she was in the middle of changing was really important, because she was in the Red Cross Motor Corps, which we'll talk about in a second, but they had a morality clause. So basically, if you were caught as an unmarried woman, and all of the women were unmarried, you couldn't go if you were married. If you were caught like in the room of a man, it was assumed that you had had a sexual relationship and then you had to go home. So Mary gets thrown out of the Red Cross Motor Corps, which I'll show you here for a second. So the Red Cross Motor Corps was one of the first organized forms of like participation for women in the war. So prior to this, women have always participated in war, like definitely sometimes in battle, always in like healing arts. Like women have always, followed armies around and like sewed them up and that sort of thing. And it's always been great for prostitutes too. Soldiers love prostitutes. So like historically over the last several thousand years, of course, women have gone to war. But this was the first time that like America had organized a way for women to serve, like within the armed forces. So the Red Cross Army Corps, the Motor Corps, mostly they just drove. So they drove ambulances and they drove supplies and they drove big old trucks. So that part was very realistic. And her outfit also very realistic. And also what I think I would like to be for Halloween this year, if we have Halloween. But it was a big fuss because they had pants. And so at this time, this period in history, women still weren't really wearing pants. A few, very daring women were. But this outfit involved breeches that were like, tight to the knee and then kind of puffed out in the old-fashioned way. And you couldn't see them under their very long coats, but it was still a real big scandal that they had them wear pants. But again, they were literally at war. So to be involved in the Red Cross, the Motor Corps, you had to know not just how to drive, but also how to fix your car, which I thought was really interesting. You had to have basic mechanical skills, because if the car broke down, you were the only person there. And you did have to know basic first aid, because if you were driving the ambulance, you might have to help. So it was a really cool thing and a great way for women to participate. But they did have a morality clause, because the government has been interested in controlling women's bodies since it started. So basically, even though the soldiers were allowed to kind of do whatever, and a lot of them came home with STDs, if the women were even suspected of such a thing, they were sent home. And married women were not allowed to participate because it was assumed that they would be at home with their babies. Divorced women were allowed to, well, actually, they weren't divorced women. Widowed women were allowed to participate, but it was mostly for like young adventurous girls, as you can see here. All right, so the end of the war. So we talked about this yesterday. Basically, there was the armistice on November 11th at 11/11. But the armistice was sort of like a placeholder. It was sort of like, we haven't finished, like this war's not over, but we will stop shooting each other for a little while. So the armistice was, again, November 1918, and then of course the Treaty of Versailles, not for months and months later until 1919. So for the most part, people took the armistice as the end, and they started sending soldiers home after the armistice, although they didn't send everybody home until later. So this is from the Daily Telegram, but I love this one. World War is over. I dream of having headlines like this one day. COVID is defeated. We'll see. We'll see. So they come home, and this is the first time that we really start to acknowledge that the soldiers are having a hard time. who come home. A lot of these soldiers were just super disillusioned, and a lot of them had, again, what we called shell shock at the time, which we're called PTSD now. And they were like kind of mad because like nobody had really won this war, and they weren't sure what they'd all been fighting for, and it had been a lot of casualties and like a really terrible. Like it had been a very, very terrible experience for them. And not having an outright victory was also sort of disappointing. So there were parades. A lot of them did get, like a hero's welcome, and they were like, wow, look at you, you did such a good thing. But there weren't like lasting care efforts. Again, we didn't invent the GI Bill until World War II. There wasn't medical care available for them. There certainly wasn't mental health care because we sort of hadn't invented that yet either. There weren't like jobs available for them or housing. So a lot of men came home injured, like horrifically physically injured, and couldn't get jobs or housing. And a lot of men came home with mental trauma. So the way that Jack is sort of acting at the end is actually very realistic. It's not that he's not happy to be home, it's that he's sort of disillusioned, and he has to go face David's family and talk to his mom, and that part is super dramatic. And I'm sort of glad they included that, because it could have been a movie about like how cool are airplane fights, very cool. But instead it kind of was a movie about like, wow, the war was hard, So I'm glad that they had that level of honesty. And again, I think they had that level of honesty because so many of the men involved in the movie had been in the war. So the soldiers had sort of a rough time. This picture is from Philadelphia, I think, from a parade that they had for soldiers from World War I. So ultimately, it was like a good movie all by itself. It had all the things we like. It had like fights and explosions and airplanes and Clara Bow. But historically, it turned out to be an important movie as well, because it was the first movie about World War I. The practical effects, again, outstanding, and also the violation of the Hays Code put it in the history books for sort of other reasons. So even though on the surface it's kind of a silly movie, it's like it's kind of a love story, a love triangle that just happens to have airplanes. Historically, it really did a lot of things that were firsts that we had never seen before. So historically, it did have that level of importance. And that is all that you need to know about Wings. I'm just kidding. You need to know more things, but that's all I'm going to tell you for right this second. What kinds of questions do you have? Not any for now? Okay. So what we'll do tomorrow when we come back for discussion is talk about some of the stuff that we, that I sort of mentioned today that was unusual, especially in regard to like the way that the soldiers are depicted and like what it looks like war is like from the inside of this movie. But other than that, I guess we'll have a relatively short day today because I just wanted to tell you about a very strange silent film. So if you haven't seen it, please go watch it. It's unusual, but like worth watching, right? Like that's the point of core, is like to show you things that you might not see otherwise. And also you do need to know about Clara Bow because she's important. Any final questions before we disband?
She's pretty.
She's so pretty.
I have one quick question.
Yes.
If you remember the part where it was like a bomb had dropped, and then there's a man just sitting there like on the side, and he just fell over. Was he supposed to be like in shell shock, or did he actually die?
There was one explosion where they accidentally did blow up an extra, and he kind of floats through the air. He was okay, but no. And I think if I'm thinking of the one that you're thinking of, I think he was just faking. But there was one explosion where an extra kind of flew through the air, so you might be thinking of that one.
Would you mind clarifying what Hays Code is? I'm not sure.
So in 1934, there was this guy Hayes who was kind of a prude, and he wanted to make it illegal for movies and for any printed material to show any aspect of sexuality or drinking. It's basically a morality code. So they made it so that you couldn't film things that they believed to be offensive, and you couldn't send pornography through the mail either. That was a whole problem because people had been since we invented mail. So basically, the Hays Code was a morality code.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. And they didn't disband it until 1968. And weirdly enough, the person who was like really instrumental in getting it disbanded was Hugh Hefner, because he wanted to mail out Playboy magazine. Hugh Hefner did a lot of things in his life. All right, core, see? Learning all the things. All right, well, if you guys are okay, I will release you for the day, and tomorrow we'll get together and talk about this very strange movie. All right. Goodbye. Goodbye. Have a good day.
Bye.